When you think of New Jersey, crime may be one of the first things to come to mind. Certainly, it's the reason we're the setting for so many mobster movies and TV shows. However, things like robbery and murder, while they do occur, are generally relegated to one of our urban centers. Sorry, Newark, reputations are earned. While certainly not limited to cities, something like a violent murder occurring out in the sticks is rare enough that when it does occur, it garners a certain visceral reaction. Things like that just don't happen here, the villagers say. That is, until they do. And that was certainly the case in 1843. In the small New Jersey hamlet of Changewater, a horrific crime would destroy not one, but two families, and demonstrate in the most brutal way that greed and violence are not limited to urbanites. I really don't often say this, but stick around because this one is a doozy. Welcome to Words and Coffee, where we talk interesting history about the Garden State and enjoy a cup of small batch roasted goodness. Today's brew is Firewatch by Ariel Resupply Coffee, and the history is the Changewater murders. Let's get to it. Murder is never a pleasant subject, but even worse is when the victims and perpetrators are bound by affection or blood. Perhaps it's easier to think that such things can only happen among strangers. Because the alleged murderers and victims in this case were related, the event garnered a great deal of attention, making the newspapers as far away as Virginia. Thus, because this is a matter of family, it is necessary for us to understand the key players among the Kastners and the Parks. I have to preface this by warning you, there's like 5 Johns and 3 Peters, a Sarah that turned into a Sally, a Rachel that turned into a Rebecca. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to go with middle names or nicknames, but I will try to be consistent. Where portraits are provided, they're not real, and it's only for the sake of helping keep track of who is who. Center of this story is John B. Park, a 61-year-old landowner nicknamed Old Johnny, henceforth referred to as John B. And he was among the wealthiest men in the county. He owned a number of farms in the area surrounding Washington, New Jersey, employed several people, and was generally well regarded. Of the 3 farms he owned, he lived at the farm in Changewater with his sister Maria and her family, the Kastners. This included her children, Mary, age 3, John Jr., age 6, and Victor, age 9, as well as her husband, also named John, but hereafter simply referred to as Kastner. I told you, there's a lot of Johns. Now, the Park and Kastner families were quite wealthy for the time. John B.'s will, on file at the Belvedere Courthouse, recorded his estate valued at $15,000 plus whatever cash he had on hand. This was counted up after his death and totaled at around $9,000 in various denominations. More on that later. For comparison, the average wages at the time ranged from something like $10 to $20 per month. So, John B. effectively had something like 37 years worth of wages stashed away in his house, as banks were still kind of unreliable at the time. Because they're a lot better now. That's all I'm going to say about that. And this made Castor somewhat nervous to share a roof with what must have been an extremely tempting target for theft or robbery. You see where this might be going. Besides the Kastners and John B., a young farmhand named Jesse Force and John B.'s 55-year-old sister Sarah also lived at the house. As for the other Park family members, John B. had 2 brothers, David and Abner, and 2 sisters, Rachel and Sarah. David was postmaster in nearby New Hampton, well regarded and had 9 children of his own, but his son, Peter W. Park, is the only one we really need to know about. Now, Abner was married to a Lydia Bowlby, with whom he had 7 children. His sons-in-law, Joseph Carter Jr. and Henry Hummers, will be central characters in this story as well. And finally, the sisters Sarah and Rachel will also be important. Bigger cast than Game of Thrones, I tell you. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of May, 1843. The sun is hanging low off the horizon, having not even burned off the morning haze. All in all, It holds the promise of a beautiful spring day. A farmer named Stacy Bowlby left his place in Lebanon on his way to Port Colden to run an errand. Upon entering the north end of the village of Changewater, Stacy was obliged to walk around a large sinkhole in the road. This was one of those things that was kind of a reoccurring problem and mostly blended into the scenery. However, on this morning, Stacy happened to glance inside and observed what he later described as a scarecrow. Upon further examination, he realized that it was actually the body of a dead man. Horrified, he ran for the nearest building, a 2-story stone house, and started banging on the door, calling for help. There was no answer. He next went to the grist mill, where he found 2 men at work. After a short explanation, the 3 of them returned to the sinkhole. Upon examining the body, the grist mill workers recognized the corpse as that of John Kastner, and found what appeared to be the murder weapon, a wooden post from a fence. It was also then that they realized the nearby house, which Bowlby had first attempted to get help from, was Kastner's farm. This begged the question, if Kastner was dead here, what had happened to the family? Cautiously, they entered the house and discovered a grisly scene. The first bodies they found were that of Maria Kastner, John Kastner's wife, and their 3-year-old daughter Mary Matilda. They were in the downstairs bedroom, apparently dead by blunt force trauma, like Kastner had been outside. Continuing the search, they proceeded upstairs to find John B., initially reported with his throat cut, but later revealed to be blunt force trauma as well, and with a pillow over his face. His desk lay open and ransacked. Also upstairs was Jesse Force, a 17-year-old farmhand, attacked and left for dead, but thankfully survived, and not only recovered, but would later go on to serve in the American Civil War. Only Kastner's sons, Victor and John Jr., were spared entirely, having been overlooked in a back room. However, this was tempered by the fact that they had just awoken, and instead of getting a kiss from their mother, they just found out they had become orphans. Yeah, I'm sorry, this is not going to be a funny one. As the grim reality of what had transpired became apparent, word spread and a crowd began to form. However, a search of the house turned up little in the way of evidence. Among John B.'s personal possessions were several $1,000s in various flavors of money. While not unusual for the time, this becomes relevant later. The villagers were shocked at the heinousness of the crime. Such things simply didn't happen in a place like Changewater, and as the shock wore off, it wouldn't be a stretch to say they were out for blood. By early afternoon, the coroner made his report, concluding that Kastner and his family had been foully murdered by a person or persons within the last few hours, pointing to the fact that the bodies were still warm. And now the search for the killers was on. Now these days, fans of the true crime genre will probably be generally familiar with the standard procedure for investigating a murder. And while the Changewater investigators didn't have anything in the way of DNA testing, cell phone records, or even formal training, their investigation was nevertheless thorough, perhaps excessively so. Backing up just a moment, as word spread of the murders, the violence of the crime, and probably the victims of Maria and Mary Matilda in particular, sparked outrage. At the funeral, officiated by one Reverend Jacob Kastner, apparently no relation, but wow, that's one heck of a coincidence. The caskets were reportedly opened just prior to burial, which was unusual. It's unclear why this was done. Some claim it was to rile up the crowd and get them frothing at the mouth for vengeance, or simply to give a chance for last respects to be paid by those who had been late to the ceremony. Bear in mind, this was seen as a major tragedy, and there were a lot of mourners in attendance. In any case, it wasn't long before rewards were posted for the arrest and conviction of the guilty parties. One reward of $300 was issued by New Jersey Governor Pennington. John B.'s brother David and Kastner's father Abraham posted a combined reward of $1,000. Put a pin in that because we'll come back to it. And Warren County chipped in another $800, bringing the total up to something like 5 times what the average worker earned in a year. Now, the investigation wasn't what you might expect by modern standards. A week after the murder, D.A. William Morris arrived in Washington and set up shop in Doolittle's Tavern. This was one of those weird quirks that I just love about history. I'm just imagining a bunch of cops and lawyers sitting around a bar, throwing back a pint while they interview suspects, probably wearing a top hat with a pipe stuck in his mouth and a vast pocket watch. But I digress. Due to the front page news nature of these murders, Morris was under intense pressure to get this thing solved and in a timely manner. He was aided by a committee of influential citizens, according to some, or alternatively, vigilantes, depending on your flavor of justice. Honestly, I originally wrote a gag referring to these guys as the Justice League, but no joke, they called themselves the Holy Alliance Company, which I am going to honor. And honestly, the HAC did about as well as might be expected. Comprised of the citizens Moore Furman, Jacob Davis, and one constable, Peter Van Dorn, they were arguably just as motivated by the reward money as anything else. So take that for what it is. There was also a competing amateur sleuth club, but they didn't really do as much, so I mostly left them out. Now, the HAC arrested a lot of people, most of them on dubious grounds. Now, to be fair, their investigation wasn't wholly incompetent. They uncovered the following. Number 1, horse tracks. As this was an unpaved road in the late springtime, it was muddy, and fresh footprints near Kastner's body led the investigators to the Musconetcong River, across which was a fallen tree often used as a footbridge. Suspecting this to be where the murderers made their escape, the investigators followed and, sure enough, found more prints on the far side. This included those of several horses and a cart. Not much to go on, right? I mean, after all, horses are fairly common at this point in time. What's that really going to tell us? Well, one print in particular drew the investigators' attention. It featured a hoof with a wedged insert. Now, this is something used by farriers to adjust the angle of the horse's toe against the ground. And where do you go for questions about horseshoes? Why, the blacksmith, of course. Consulting William Dilts of Washington Township revealed that, yes, indeed, he was quite familiar with that particular wedge, because he made it for one customer. Joseph Carter, Jr., John B.'s nephew-in-law. All right, so you got a horse at the scene of the murder. Any number of explanations for that, right? Circumstantial at best. A good lawyer could make sure that never stuck. Okay, but how do you explain number 2, the New Hope Bridge money? Maybe there was an innocent explanation for why this horse was there on that night, and if there were, the investigators surely would have found it. Probably. But upon looking more closely into Carter's recent activities, they found more evidence. Pretty damning stuff, too. Alright, let's talk about Joe Carter for a moment. He married into the Park family through Olivia Park, Abner's daughter and John B.'s niece. She and Joe had 2 children and operated the Meeting House farm, which adjoined Mansfield Cemetery. Notably, he also owed money to John B., as well as Constable Van Dorn. Remember the guy on the HAC? And also a man in Phillipsburg named Howell, among others. Carter was acquainted with his wife's brother, Peter W. Park, one of John B.'s other nephews, and David Park's son. Remember David? He's the guy that offered the reward for information about the killings. Also a Freemason. I mentioned this for absolutely no reason. Now, it seems a matter of debate just how friendly Carter and Peter were, whether there was genuine affection between them or just family ties. Either way, Peter swore that when he arrived at his sister's house that morning, Carter and Henry Hummer, married to Peter's other sister, were both working in the field. Peter W. may also have had several outstanding debts, but this is less clear than in Carter's case. Together, these men were very familiar with John B.'s dealings and affairs and his financial situation. So, the same day as Kastner and the other victims are discovered, Carter started paying off debts, like 5 or 6 of them, to the tune of $100, money he was in no way supposed to have. Okay, again, circumstantial, but maybe... No. See, Carter was paying off these debts using a very particular kind of currency. See, in those days, private companies could issue legal tender, provided they had permission from the legislature. Sort of akin to paying your friend in Amazon gift cards to drive you to the airport. One local company was the nearby New Hope Bridge Company. A week earlier, they had paid John B. an undisclosed amount, but likely somewhere in the neighborhood of thousands of dollars. This money was not found in the Kastner's house. And so when Joe Carter was paying off all these debts with money seemingly acquired out of thin air, and bearing the mark of a company that had recently settled a bill with John B., money that was no longer in John B.'s house, people naturally started asking questions. I mean, this was the day after, the day. And one of those debts he was trying to pay off, allegedly, in the cemetery. Also notably, Peter was one of the few mourners who did not go up to pay last respects to the open caskets, claiming that John B. was his good friend. Again, nothing solid, just very sus. So usually I like to follow the rule of three with these things, but in this case, no. I mean, it was the same money. The same money. Now, really, Joe Carter was the most promising lead, and suspicion was cast on his friends by association more than anything else. In fact, defending Joe Carter or providing him with an alibi was a surefire way to come under question yourself. At least it was enough for a warrant. Nearly 2 weeks after the murders on May the 14th, Joe Carter, Peter Park, Henry Hummer, and even Abner Park, John B.'s own brother, were all arrested for the murders. Alright, so I'm obviously laying this on a little thick here for the sake of storytelling, painting a very specific picture. But to the investigators' credit, they made an attempt to give the accused the benefit of the doubt. I mean, surely no truly guilty individual would be so cold or heartless as to try to spend the money of their ill-gotten gains at the victim's own funeral, right? When asked about the source of his newfound wealth, considering he had been a debtor just one day earlier, when his uncle-in-law was, alive, Carter was never able to provide a satisfactory answer. "I can't tell you," was his go-to response. Yeah, no shit you can't. Realizing that wasn't going to fly, he came up with something like Olivia was supposed to inherit it upon John B.'s death. Unfortunately, the guy he was trying to scam with that one happened to be Peter Van Dorn, a member of the Holy Alliance Company trying to collect on reward money. And he was like, no, none of that is true. Carter's sister would later testify that he did in fact earn this money after selling meat and vegetables in New York. This is dubious for a variety of reasons, and if it was the case, it sure would have been a good idea to mention this to the cops. Now, Peter, on the other hand, did have an alibi, and a pretty good one. See, on the night in question, his wife and child were both sick, as witnessed by their nurse, Prudence Williamson. She took over at midnight, at which point they were all in the same room until dawn. We'll come back to that. So, to recap, Carter was suddenly able to pay off large debts using a particular flavor of money known to belong to the deceased, which was now missing. This seemed pretty cut and dry to the investigators, and thus anyone who claimed they were either with Carter or defended him came under suspicion by proxy. There were actually several trials, two for Carter and Abner each, and one each for the rest of the defendants. The first beginning about 3 months after the murders, and the whole process took about 2 years from start to finish. It's actually somewhat comforting to know that the justice system has been dysfunctional even back then. The grand jury was charged by State Supreme Court Justice James S. Nevius, who described the crime as indiscriminate butchery, adding that it was a deed of darkness and cruelty and blood, and none but a demon in human shape could have perpetrated such a thing.
That is the most metal thing I ever heard in my whole life.
Now bear in mind, this thing was front page news for 100 miles, so it took them a couple weeks to assemble a jury that at least appeared to be unbiased. Carter was tried first, as the evidence against him was most damning. Still pretty thin, but the prosecution's strongest case. However, to their surprise and frustration, Carter was initially acquitted. Initially. The witnesses for the prosecution were many, and their testimonies ranged from damning to circumstantial to downright dubious. Understand the challenge here. There were no living witnesses. Jesse Force, the only victim to survive his attack, had been sleeping and was then knocked unconscious. However, he did recall that John B. had been sitting at his desk that evening going over his accounting books. He also noted that the Kastner's dog, an excitable animal that barked at unfamiliar people, made no sound that night. It was also attested that Kastner didn't entertain visitors at night by himself, owing to the presence of large sums of money in the house. Thus, since Kastner didn't wake Jesse that night, it was concluded that whoever drew Kastner out of the house was known to him. But the prosecution's main piece of evidence was the letter. Among the people that Carter owed money to was John Howell of Phillipsburg, the last big town on the way to Pennsylvania. Carter was scheduled to meet with Howell on the day of the murders, but clearly was unable to make that appointment. He wrote a letter explaining the situation. This much is not in dispute. This letter was conveyed by a man named Abraham Kugel, who would later testify to this fact. Now, this part is crucial because it would indicate whether Carter had advanced knowledge of the murders. On what day was the letter written? Kugel always started his walk early since getting to Phillipsburg and back took most of a day. Carter swore it was the day after the murders, which would naturally absolve him. But Kugel maintained, under cross-examination, that he received it the morning of May 2nd, before knowledge of the murders had become widely known. Two of Carter's employees testified on his behalf, and one of Kugel's did the same for him. So, effectively a toss-up who you believe. Unfortunately, Mr. Howell himself did not receive the letter until the 5th. Kugel had delivered it to a bartender who acted as an unofficial post office, and so he was unable to lend his voice one way or the other. And it turned out that after reading the letter, he burned it. So, and this becomes something of a recurring theme here, we may never know the whole truth. Which is especially frustrating for reasons that will become apparent later. Next came the defense, which amounted to each of the accused vouching for each other, along with their families and two of Carter's employees. Again, hardly unbiased witnesses there, but then again, in this trial, who isn't? There was also Carter's sister-in-law, Eliza, who bore witness that she had seen him return with money 3 fingers thick, a unique unit of measurement, after a recent trip to New York, where he sold meat and vegetables, apparently providing an alternative explanation for this sudden wealth. Why this was apparently never mentioned before is unclear, as is why he would have been paid with New Hope money all the way up in New York. Now, the prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of one of Kastner's employees, Margaret Martinez, who claimed to have overheard Carter asking Peter if he looked guilty. Damning stuff indeed. I'll come back to Margaret. There was also testimony from a man named Jesse Tiger, who claimed that Joe Carter and Peter Park had approached him, attempting to recruit him into the murder. It is unclear exactly what they were offering him in exchange or what their prior relationship was, other than Carter had previously helped Tiger get home after being passed out in a ditch. But ultimately, the jury was convinced that above all else, Kastner would not have opened the door for an unfamiliar person, and they reached their decisions. Abner Park and Henry Hummer were both acquitted. Joe Carter was acquitted for the death of John Kastner, but convicted for the deaths of the others. Some might call that double jeopardy. In fact, Carter's lawyer did just that. And the response from the court was, "Nuh-uh, different murders, bruh." Okay, joking aside, that's pretty much what their argument was. Peter Park was convicted for the death of Kastner almost entirely on the testimony of Martinez and Tiger. Carter and Peter were then condemned to hang from the neck until dead. The remaining Park family members near bankrupted themselves in paying for the legal defense, but after exhausting their appeals, both men were eventually hanged in front of the Belvedere Courthouse on August the 22nd, 1845. And there you go. That's the story of the Changewater murders. Except... it turns out there's more to this story, like a lot more. So, in the surface level take, 2 men were tried and found guilty and, unsurprisingly, went to their graves proclaiming their innocence. But was this the antebellum version of making a murderer? So, spoiler, probably yes, but I don't know. No one knows. No one will ever really know. However, there are a lot of things in the record that simply don't add up. And it's pretty clear that the investigation was fundamentally flawed. Holy Alliance Company, vigilante investigators, and much of the testimony completely falls apart under closer analysis. Take, for example, the testimony of Margaret Martinez, who supposedly overheard the conversation between Carter and Peter, where they asked each other if they looked guilty. That really, cartoonish scene. Well, she had a reputation in town as an awful old liar, information the jury would not have been privy to, as the trial occurred in Trenton and not Washington. On top of that, George Martinez, possibly Margaret's husband or brother, it's unclear. He visited Kastner the day before the murders asking to borrow money, a request that was denied. This seems relevant, and for all the arrests made by the Holy Alliance Company, George was notably not among them. Possibly because he fled town. Make of that what you will. Yeah, and that's another thing. Right from the start, the HAC focused exclusively on men within the city limits. So all I gotta do is just keep walking in that direction with the money, and I'm good. Nah, no one will ever think to do that. Also, just men. Make a note of that. We'll come back to it later. Now, Jesse Tiger, who was allegedly approached by Joe and Peter to participate in the murder with the promise of money, also had a reputation in town as a liar, a drunkard, and a chicken thief, which is just such an old-timey insult, it's darkly humorous. Again, this was information that probably was not made available to the jury. For his part, Peter claimed he had never met Jesse Tiger, nor had any association with him. That was until Tiger was brought to Peter's shoe shop by his brother-in-law, William Holshizer. We're going to get back to Holshizer in a minute because that gets spicy. So, testimony of questionable credibility, that's bad enough. But there's pretty compelling evidence to suggest the state actually tampered with witnesses or otherwise compelled them to change their statements. During Abner Park's trial, that's again John's brother, Joseph Bowlby swore under oath that he saw the man walking down the road from the direction where the murders took place. This was despite the fact that Abner had crippling rheumatoid arthritis and barely left his house. This also directly contradicted Bowlby's testimony from the first trial, where he stated, at least twice, that he had not seen Abner within 12 hours of the murder. It begs the question, was Bowlby urged in some way to change his story? One funny aside, when Abner was asked to enter his plea to the court, he replied, "As clear as the angels in heaven," which, frankly, is kind of a badass old man move, let's be honest. As for Mr. Bowlby, he may have had a public axe to grind with Abner, who I think was his brother-in-law. Lydia Bowlby, I think, was Joseph Bowlby's sister. Also, you might recall that Stacy Bowlby was the man who originally found Kastner's body in the ditch. Semi-serious hypothesis here. With all the Johns and Joes and Bowlbys, maybe they genuinely forgot who is who. Point is, this was one of many cases of questionable or contradictory testimony that ultimately tainted the final verdict. The state put 93 witnesses against Abner, and it was only because of an absolutely ironclad alibi, the same story from 4 different people, that the charges didn't stick. Failing that, what chance did Carter and Peter really have? This is kind of exemplified by the fact that Prudence Williamson's testimony that Peter was at the house all night, in the same room as she was disregarded in favor of Margaret Martinez's or Tiger's. At the very least, this seems to fall well short of the beyond reasonable doubt standard. But to be fair, I am not an antebellum lawyer. Now, with all this in mind, let's talk about that letter again. The one supposedly proving Carter's foreknowledge of the murders. The state never produced it. Mr. Howell testified that he received it, but the delivery date was only corroborated by Kugel, who may or may not have been reliable. A lot of hay has been made regarding the role and motivation of the Holy Alliance Company. These were hardly disinterested parties after all. Something to keep in mind about small towns at this time is there is a lot of intermarrying and in-laws and cousins, and everyone knows everyone. And it got downright silly at times. I haven't even talked about Mr. Smith yet. A name so generic he might as well have been a source familiar with the matter. This was a man from another town, apparently with no prior relationship to anyone in Changewater. But he had a dream about the murders. And several people, such as Edward Thompson, were briefly detained by the HAC because, wait for it, Mr. Smith saw him commit the murders in his dream. Do you see what I mean when I say this is darkly tragic? If it didn't call into question an event which resulted in 6 dead bodies, 2 orphans, and 2 destroyed families, this whole thing would almost be farcical. One final point, and take this how you will, but Reverend Kastner, the priest who conducted the funeral service for the family and married all the parties involved, he spoke with Carter the night before his execution. Prior to that, the priest claimed to waver as to the guilt or innocence of the men. That was until Carter asked whether a man could still go to heaven if he was present for a murder but did not actually participate. Did he actually say that, or did Reverend Kastner, again, apparently no relation, just the world's biggest coincidence, did he say this under pressure to help the state save face? Don't make me tap the sign. All right, so if Joe and Peter were picked as targets of opportunity so that the state could put a bow on this thing and save face and say they did their job, if they didn't do it, well, then who did? So, from what I gather, there were two other realistic alternatives. The first is an out of towner simply referred to as Atkinson. Who's that? No one really knows. And for all the indiscriminate arrests made by the HAC, they never followed up with this guy who was pointed out by William Dilts, the blacksmith who noted Carter's unique horseshoe. To be fair, he'd already left town, and the Holy Alliance Company really didn't feel like walking. All right, buckle up because I'm about to blow your mind. During his examination, Dilt stated his suspicions of the man Atkinson, who visited his shop the week before the murders. He then asked Dilt if he ever thought about robbing John B. and then running out west with the money. This was all conveyed to us through Peter's writings in the month leading up to his execution. And we don't have the court testimony, so take it with a grain of salt, I guess. But damning stuff indeed, if even half of it is true. And a figurative, if not literal, crime that they never followed up with it. For his part, Atkinson apparently left town right after the murders, never to be seen again. Killed by accident in Lockport, New York during the trial, and thus could no longer be questioned. It could certainly be argued that an out-of-towner, someone unfamiliar with the family, the layout of the house, could more easily have overlooked the boys Victor and John Jr. And who's to say that the dog never barked? Suffering a traumatic brain injury, I would certainly question Jesse Forge's reliability as a witness. The second alternative suspect had nearly as much circumstantial evidence against him as Carter or Peter. We kind of glossed over him before, but I'd like to give a little bit more attention to him now. Remember Sarah Park, John B.'s younger sister who lived with him and the Kastners? Remember how she was conspicuously absent the night of the murders? You're going to love this. So her alibi was that she was staying with her sister Rachel and family. Reason being, Rachel's child was terribly sick that night. Oh, good at her for helping out, yeah? The child was 18 years old on the night in question, and her bed at the Kastner's house was unmade, as though she had left in a hurry. At night. So what caused her to leave at that particular time? This was also the first night Sarah had slept away from home in several years. Oh, and after the murders were discovered, she got into a few fights with the family over inheritance. And it gets better. Her sister Rachel was married to William Holshizer. Remember him? He introduced Peter to Mr. Tiger, who would later testify at the trials. And Holshizer had a well-known feud with his brother-in-law. John B. reportedly hated the man, writing in his will 15 years earlier that Holshizer was his, quote, sworn enemy, and that he would never inherit any part of his estate. Barring, of course, the $100 a month for life payment Rachel was to receive upon her brother's death, which she sued her brothers David and Abner for in 1844, while Abner was on trial. So yeah, priorities. Now, William was initially arrested by the HAC due to his past history with John B. But his wife Rachel and sister-in-law Sarah provided him with two alibis. Whether you believe them is up to you, but considering how many witnesses we have selectively ignored or chosen to believe at this point, why stop now? As an aside, William was not a good guy. During the trials for Carter and the others, William was the subject of his own accusations. An event that occurred the year before the murders but wasn't reported until 1845, William allegedly engaged in, quote, criminal intercourse with his neighbor's wife. Not sure if that means adultery or assault, but in any case, he was excommunicated over it. Okay, bad, but that's a pretty big jump from assault to conspiracy to murder. As for the living sons, Victor and John Jr., they would go on to live with both their aunts, Rachel and Sarah, at different times. So if they were somehow involved in the murder, well, that's kind of messed up. So in the end, what is that to go on? Not a whole lot. But if nothing else, I think we can agree that at best the investigation was rushed and potentially coerced into a desired conclusion by the state. the consequences of which were very real. Joe Carter and Peter Park were publicly executed in front of the Belvedere Courthouse at noon on the 22nd of August, 1845, to a large crowd. Some estimates go as high as 10,000 people in attendance. Even for the time when public executions were seen as a kind of social event, it raised some eyebrows about propriety. One account made some pearl-clutching remarks about how it was indecent that so many women were in attendance, but explained it away due to their, quote, rustic training. Does this urban-rural divide come up a lot or what? No funeral service followed their execution. As the pair had been convicted of murder, they were denied a Christian burial in a cemetery and instead buried at the crossroads of the Port Colden, Changewater, and Anderson roads, what is today the intersection of New Jersey routes 632 and 651. The original stone markers have since been lost, and some question whether the current tags accurately represent the actual location. But barring ground-penetrating radar or a shovel, it's the best we have to go on. The house where the murders took place still exists today. Shown here, it's the stone portion of the building on the right. In fact, John Jr. would go on to live in that house for the rest of his life. One can only imagine his state of mind constantly occupying the place where most of his family was wiped out. The Park family was ruined both socially and financially by this event, and many of them moved out west following the trial, hoping to get a fresh start. Alright, so I'm just going to say it. When I started researching this, I thought the official story was pretty conclusive, that Carter and Peter were in fact guilty, but the more I read into this, the less sure I became. And now, personally, I think the New Hope money is a pretty strong indicator that Carter was involved in some way. Maybe his role was just to lure Kastner outside, but he didn't actually commit the killings. Perhaps he was approached by, say, a passing drifter who had just gotten information from the blacksmith and sensed a juicy target. This individual might have then sought people familiar with the target and got them to help him out. Perhaps in his financial desperation, Carter might have considered taking part in a simple robbery, not expecting the bloodshed to come. This version is not without flaws, I'll fully admit, but for example, if Carter was involved, I find it hard to believe that he never started pointing fingers. I don't know if plea deals were a thing back then, but you'd think that if this went down as it was alleged, someone would have attempted to distance themselves at least from the murder of the little girl. At the very least, maybe they could have appealed on accessory charges. Peter's involvement was even more dubious, and he wrote a 24-page pamphlet from prison documenting in great detail why he was innocent. The lack of barking from the dog strongly suggests someone familiar with the family. However, that would seem to be contradicted by sparing the boys. You're familiar enough with the house that the dog doesn't bark at you, but you don't realize there's two other kids and a bed behind this door. It just doesn't add up. Sarah's conspicuous absence, thus escaping the murders, seems like a huge red flag for me, but for the reason I just mentioned, I don't put much significance behind it. And they found $9,000 in the house. If this was a robbery, why didn't they take it? It wasn't locked away. Most of it was just sitting in the chest at the end of the bed, wrapped in socks. Maybe the perp just grabbed what was on the desk? For that to be true, we have to believe that the perp bludgeoned 4 people to death and attempted 5 because he believed there was a fortune within, and then just kind of grabbed what was available with no further investigation. This has led many people to speculate that the true target wasn't the money in the house, but the inheritance. I believe that the authorities were under intense public pressure to get answers in the worst possible way, and they got just that. The investigation was sloppy. The jury pool was tainted. In fact, it took them weeks to find 12 men who hadn't already made up their minds. Front page news for 100 miles. Most of the testimony was tainted or outright dubious. However, since most of it was lost, I think one quote from the reading of Peter's guilty verdict says it all. Quote, "The verdict is in full accordance with public sentiment." End quote. Mob. Mob. The word you're looking for is mob. In a final twist, John B.'s property was sold and the proceeds were dispersed among his heirs. Thus, the children who lost their fathers were paid by the man for whose murder they were executed. And if that just isn't a darkly humorous mixture of tragedy and irony, I don't know what is. That'll about wrap it up for me. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. Sources in the description. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.